Give me just a sec here, folks. It went in so easily before, and now I can't seem to get it in my ear. Give me one more second, folks. Thanks. Okay. Thank you for that patience. Welcome to our both in-person, our intimate in-person audience, and our rather large virtual audience this evening. I'm Tiziana Dearing. I am the host of Radio Boston, and we appreciate you joining us for this town hall discussion about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We look forward to an evening of community and learning together as we confront this difficult subject. It's been less than 2 weeks since the invasion began, and already the conflict has wrought immense devastation with military and civilian casualties mounting. Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, estimated today that as many as 2 million people have now fled Ukraine. As the Russian shelling continues, reports of dire need for food, water, heat, medicine in some areas are leading to a growing humanitarian crisis and sense of humanitarian urgency. And in response, the US, along with Europe and other allies, have targeted Russia with the toughest sanctions. Just today, President Joe Biden announced that the US will ban all Russian oil imports in an escalation of economic penalties as global pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin to end the violence continues to ratchet up. That's the situation that we're in. In the face of this crisis and with such a complex situation in front of us, we welcome you to join us as we learn and ask questions. The people who will help guide us and teach us tonight, Emily Channell-Justice. She is the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine program at Harvard. She encouraged me not to say that too many times or too quickly. And Monica Duffy Toft, professor of international politics at Tufts Fletcher School. Welcome to both of you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Throughout the evening, we have about an hour together. I'll be asking questions of my own and taking your questions. We do want you to get involved. You can use Slido to ask your questions. So you go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, and you can type the # or hashtag WBUR to ask your questions. So at Radio Boston, often with a tough or complex situation, I find that the right first question is just how bad is it? Mm-hmm. So why don't I start with you, Emily? In your mind, today, how bad is it?
Well, it's bad. You have given us some good information coming out of the UN and kind of an overview of what we're looking at today. It's the 13th day of the invasion. People are both stuck and moving. There's a lot of moving parts, and that's part of why it's very difficult to know how to respond all the time. People are becoming more entrenched in the places where they're staying, but a lot more people are also moving. Ukraine is a country with at least 40 million people, and only 2 million of those have left. So that leaves quite a lot of people who have stayed in Ukraine. Some of that's by choice, some of it's not by choice. People are suffering from air raids all the time. Civilian corridors have been attacked. Any step toward negotiation is kind of coming with a little bit of, I don't know, a grain of salt or a little hesitation, because so far a lot of the negotiation with Russia has not been in good faith. And so at the same time that we're seeing, on the one hand, things are getting a lot worse, on the other hand, the people who have decided to stay are fighting however they can, and so they're refusing to give up, and that sentiment still stands today.
Monica, how about from your perspective, how bad is it?
I think it's pretty bad. President Vladimir Putin's next move, his first move was to capture Kharkiv, in order to get Kyiv to capitulate. That did not happen. The Russian military has shown itself to be not the best fighting force. To be clear, things are going to get a lot worse, Tiziana, especially as they move into the urban areas. Training, weapons, doctrine around urban warfare is simply not in the Russian military's DNA. More troubling, Russia has a long, long history of promising safe zones. We're seeing this. And then systematically attacking those safe zones and also attacking civilians attempting to flee what are supposed to be safe zones. They're going to deliberately continue to attack hospitals, schools, and they have no contingencies to spare any of Ukraine's cultural, spiritual sites. And I'm concerned that these may themselves be targets. I think the human cost is dreadful because it's part of an effort to extinguish that Ukraine has a distinct culture from Russia. So in short, I think we should expect to see the next couple of days, I pray it's not weeks, that the Russian military is going to hammer and destroy Ukraine's main metropolitan areas. They're moving in on Odessa without regard for civilians, even small children. We're seeing that. President Putin's trying to strangle Ukraine. That is what he is. Let's make no bones about it. He's trying to strangle Ukraine and weaken it to the point where President Volodymyr Zelensky capitulates. And the problem here is that Zelensky cares more about his people, right, and human life than Putin does. And Putin doesn't care at all. I mean, look at the state of his soldiers. Supposedly he sent them in with 3 days of rations. This is why supermarkets are being looted. We're in day 13. These soldiers who went in on the premise of a military exercise are starving themselves. So he doesn't care about his own troops that need to be doing the fighting, but now they're dying. Do you think he cares about the Ukrainian population? No. And so right now we're at a point where war is a bargaining process. We're actually seeing the war itself, the fighting, the brutality, where each side is trying to figure out what the other side holds most dear. And until they come to the conclusion, Putin not accepting the full victory that he was thinking he was going to get, open arms and the laying down of arms and sunflowers in Ukrainians' hands, we're not going to see an end to it until Putin himself comes to the realization that he may not achieve everything that he wants.
So, Emily, have you spoken with anybody in Ukraine in the last few days? And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have. I was there in September, finishing up some research and starting some new research, and reconnected with all of my good friends there. And it's been really interesting. Haven't heard from everybody. Kind of putting out a lot of messages and getting some response back. And everybody I know is being really proactive. So they're taking the time to do a lot of translation of things into English so that people outside of Ukraine can understand what's going on. There's other people who are organizing networks of drivers. They're posting something that says, I have a car and I can fit this many people. Let me know if you need someone who needs out, right? So everybody's very actively trying to do whatever they can at the same time that they're living in really unimaginable fear. One of my dear friends was recently, her mother works at one of the archaeological museums in Kiev and decided she wouldn't leave because she can't feel in her heart, she just can't leave these materials to be destroyed, and forced her daughter to move to a safer place. And her daughter is my friend, and we were talking about this, and she, this is someone who never in her life, her family goes back, she's the Kiev local for generations. She's lived in that city her entire life, and now she has to leave because of this. And I just, it's very heart-wrenching. At the same time that immediately when she gets to a safer place, she's helping other people who have been displaced. She's helping make food. She's helping find people housing. People's initial reaction is to help. So it's hard to let yourself, I think, get too overwhelmed and paralyzed here, because you're seeing these examples of people in Ukraine in absolutely dire circumstances, and their first reaction is to do what they can and help. So I talk to them feeling, both bad and good. I'm very, very lucky so far to get a lot of responses from people who are living absolutely in a nightmare.
So Monica, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then I'd love to start asking some audience questions from there. Mm-hmm. Who have you spoken with in the last?
So I have students who are from Ukraine, so I'm talking to them and the status of their families, and this is, of course, an extraordinarily trying time for them because they feel guilty that their families are trapped in Ukraine. And then I've talked to Russian colleagues, many of whom have signed notes and letters and memoranda and declarations that they're against this war. They're sort of a rarefied group. They have VPN, virtual privacy networks, so they can get online and actually see the news or whatever news now is getting in. As we know, President Putin has been shutting down networks and independent media. But they can talk to me, I can talk to them on the phone, and we can talk about what's happening. But they too are concerned for their lives. Look, this is a dictatorship. This is a personalistic dictatorship. And we now know that if you say even the word war, vojna, in Russia, that you could have 15 years worth of jail. So the situation is pretty dire, not only in Ukraine. As Emily said, there's 44 million people that live in Ukraine. Only 2 million are on the road. That means another 42 million are trapped. The West seems okay for now. We'll see what happens to the western part of Ukraine. But then in Russia, you've got draconian laws coming into place, and anybody who wants to sort of have an utterance of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, they're going to be targeted and put in jail. And we've had thousands of Russians who are trying to fight the war who are now, in jail.
Will the internet be able to break through that? Can you lock down in the age of the internet?
Well, one of the delightful things I read last week was when Anonymous came online and said, we are fighting this war. And Anonymous last night, actually, or 2 days ago, broke into Russian television and actually broadcast video from Ukraine, from the front line. So what's really striking about this war is that it's not just kinetic, right? It's not just on the battlefield. The information war is real, and it's not just between states. We're seeing autonomous actors, independent actors, separate from even corporations. Today, McDonald's finally said they're not going to sell burgers anymore in Russia. But you have these kind of independent actors saying, I have to do something, and Anonymous, breaking through on television. The virtual privacy networks seem to be working, telephone, you can talk to us. But the problem is, Tiziana, that the Putin regime for at least 8 years, if not 15 years, has had such a strong propaganda element and program that many Russians do not believe either that the war is happening at all. You still see that, and you guys can go on CNN and Al Jazeera and other places and see the videos. And or it's not Russia doing this. Russia is defending Ukraine and Ukrainians and ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. And so getting through that disinformation and that misinformation is going to be very, very difficult.
So I'll ask our first audience question here. Volodymyr Zelensky is asking for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why has that not been done yet, and what are the challenges? Emily, maybe you can take a first pass for us.
Sure. So this echoes a lot of what the people who I'm hearing from in Ukraine. This is people who are sleeping in bunkers every night because of these air raids. This is also what they're asking for. So as we know, Vladimir Putin made a couple of speeches 2 weeks ago preempting this invasion. And one of the earlier ones, he made a very veiled threat about any Western power that intervenes will see a response like they've never seen before. And then a few days later, he made very clear that he is willing to use nuclear force on any Western ally that intervenes on behalf of Ukraine. I think that this is probably the hesitation about the no-fly zone. The no-fly zone basically would mean that NATO countries would supply fighter jets from their own, not piloted by Ukrainians, right, but by themselves, to shoot down the Russian planes that are dropping bombs on Ukraine in order to protect not just civilian corridors, but the territorial defenses and the Ukrainian military that's working on the ground. And the hesitation, I believe, is this threat that any type of involvement from NATO powers would cross a line that Vladimir Putin has decided is worth a nuclear response. I've seen some suggestions for some pretty creative workarounds, such as giving Ukraine some decommissioned fighter jets from other countries that then can become Ukrainian, right? That they could then do this work. People are trying to figure out how to get around it, but that's really the main, these threats. And since most of us did not predict that this was going to be what Putin decided to do 2 weeks ago, I think there's a lot of fear that yes, nuclear war is a terrible idea. Does that mean he won't do it? No.
So I want to stay with that, and then I have an audience follow-up question as well. So I grew up in a town in the Midwest where we knew that we had a building that was nuclear targeted. So we knew, it was the 80s when you were sure nuclear war was going to happen, and we knew we lived in a city that would get bombed, and that was a really tense reality as a kid. I think then for years after that, we sort of had this sense that deterrence just works, and the bombs are so big and the damage would be so much that no one would do it. But that's not really true, Monica, is it? There are smaller scale nuclear weapons now, and could they come home to the U.S.? I don't mean in the good way come home.
Yeah. So that's the scary part. We're not sure, because this war seems to be directed by an individual, one person, Putin, who doesn't seem to be getting the best advice or have access to the best information. And so the concern is that indeed that the nuclear taboo, that's what we talk about, the nuclear taboo. We all understand that nuclear weapons, that the programmatic situation during the Cold War was that they were for deterrence, which meant that we were not going to use them, that we were going to deter the other side through mutually assured destruction, that we would both, neither of us would come out ahead. And the problem is that what we're concerned about is, you're exactly right, Tiziana, that the Russian nuclear forces have smaller tactical nuclear weapons that they can deploy in the battlefield. And it might be the case that if we push Putin so hard into a corner, and he's already said this, like Emily, that he's already threatened that if he gets wind that Western forces come in and help out, that he will escalate, right? We talk about the escalatory ladder, right? He will escalate to nuclear. And the question for us in the West and for Ukrainians and for the globe is, what happens if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon that stays contained within a 100-mile radius, right? Does that force us then to say, that's enough for us to launch an ICBM or one of our submarine-launched missiles or one of our fighter jets? Do we actually go back to the Cold War triad of nuclear weapons use, or disavowing the deterrence for the use of a tactical nuclear weapon? We haven't been here since the 1950s, when these debates happened about whether nuclear weapons were a quantitative shift, right? Is it just more firepower, or a qualitative shift? And we came to the realization that they're a qualitative shift. We don't want to use them, right? And that's how we got mutually assured destruction. But Putin seems to be the kind of leader that is willing to perhaps risk this escalation and perhaps use a smaller tactical nuclear weapon. And then the question is how do we respond? Do we respond?
So I'm going to riff on a listener follow-up question there. With Monica saying, solo actor, isolated, we're not sure what kind of advice. My words, doesn't sound like following a rational path that is how we would have calculated how to behave and respond in the past. Is there a way to prevent, with confidence, the use of a nuclear weapon, or are we just in kind of free-for-all until we see what another world leader is going to do? Emily, you going to turf that one to Monica, or do you want to keep it?
Well, I think the only certainty is removal from power, removing Vladimir Putin from power. That's really the only certainty. And that's very scary to think that that's the only way out of, that's the only kind of mechanism for de-escalation at this point, because we know how unlikely that is and how many things will have to fall into place at the same time for that to happen. So that's kind of why I'm a little hesitant to answer, because I don't really have an optimistic response to that at all, and I don't know, maybe you would disagree a little.
I'm a little different, actually. So Tiziana, I sort of disagree with your premise that Putin is sort of irrational, kind of a madman. Look, this is a leader.
I have to say I was very careful not to use the M word, the madman word.
Madman, yeah. But I mean, this is a man who has achieved on the battlefield every objective that he's sought. So, in 1999, he pummeled Grozny, and he actually put in a puppet, Kadyrov, and managed to get Chechnya under control and under Russia's thumb. Then he got Georgia, right? He went in the summer in Georgia and basically got the Georgians, and now Georgia basically doesn't have full freedom and sovereignty the way Ukraine would like. Then he went into Crimea in 2014, successful, went into Syria, countering Obama and the Red Line. He went into Donbass and Luhansk. And so I really do believe, and then, by the way, he has spent his administration building up this formidable military. And he's being told by the generals, of course, boss, we've got a great military. We are a great power. We're making Russia great again. And so when he went into Kharkiv, you understand Kharkiv is 26 miles from the Russian border. These soldiers ran out of gas. What does this tell you, right? That the logistics train, the communications train is just not there. And this is a military that doesn't have a lot of independence among the troops. They don't trust them, right? Soviet period was similar, right? They throw a lot of men and material at the problem, but they don't throw a lot of sort of information going down the chains of command. And they expected for Kharkiv to fold. And once Kharkiv would have folded, they really did expect Kiev to. Right? And what they're doing in the South, by the way, is they really would like to control the South more because then they control the ports, they control the goods and services coming into Ukraine, right? But they really thought that by getting Kharkiv, they would then get Kyiv, and then they would get Zelensky to fold and say, okay, no NATO, no EU, you are going to be the great leader. He's basically cowing it the same way that he did to Belarus under President Lukashenko. So he's not a madman. Sorry, I'm not allowed to say that word.
No, you can.
So Tiziana, what I'd say is he's quite rational. The problem is that it didn't go the way he expected. Plan A didn't work. We're now in Plan B, and unfortunately, Plan B is pummeling the country. But I do think there may be some ground for us to negotiate. And the question is what's the off-ramp for this man, right? And so I think with some very clever diplomacy, I'm delighted to see foreign leaders going and talking to him, man on man, saying, hey, Vladimir, hey, Vlad, this isn't good. This isn't going to be good for you, and it's really not good for your country. Oh, by the way, you're trashing the global economy, and you're reinforcing NATO. Everything that you wanted, you're actually making it much more difficult for you to achieve that. And so I do think there is room still for diplomacy. The problem is not everybody is going to get what they want, meaning that the West and unfortunately Ukraine, we're going to have to negotiate some things. And I say, let's do it. Let's buy some time. Let's save some lives. Let's save destruction, and then see where we can go. The man can't live forever. And we don't know what's happening in the background with his security forces and then also with the military. But typically in Russian history, in Soviet history, Russian imperial history, the military has been very, very sort of hands-off in politics. It's the security forces around Putin that we need to keep an eye on. And go ahead.
Well, so one of the listener follows, is this really just Putin's war? Is he truly a lone actor? Or are there other individuals or groups causing or fomenting? Mm-hmm. Emily.
Yeah, I mean, not a lone actor in as much as he has this close circle of advisors that we've seen get smaller and smaller, especially through the pandemic. And so he's isolated, but I wouldn't call him a lone actor, right? Because, I mean, as you also said, Monica, he's not getting good information from all the sources that many presidents should be getting good information from. So he's surrounded himself with people who will agree with what he says. So, I mean, in terms of being a rational actor, yeah, he's a rational actor because he's created his own logic. He's created his own sense of the world. So he's acting within what makes sense of that, and there's nobody around him to tell him otherwise. And that's why it's difficult to sort of say what the tipping point is, right? Because we're not just talking about one person, whereas if you remove one person, okay, it's over. There actually is this circle there that's keeping him in power, and that's reinforcing the decisions that he's making. So smaller and smaller all the time, but still enough reinforcements to not, to be where we are right now.
So and that's why President Biden, right, and his administration is sanctioning people around him and parliamentarians who voted for this, because what they're giving him cover, right? They're giving Putin cover, and allowing for his decisions to actually be implemented. I mean, it's not like Putin can go out and fire all the missiles, right? Somebody's got to do it for him. So there are people around, but he's. I think if it were the case, maybe I'm wrong. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and anybody who tells you how they know this thing's going to end, they're wrong. War is fog. We are in the fog of war, unfortunately. But there are people within his circle who support what he's doing. But he has the authority as the president, right, of the Russian Federation to stop it.
Okay. I think I'm gonna try something, which is I'm going to try to bring it home a little bit more. We may stay in that space, we may not, but let's try that for a little bit. And I'm going to use a little bit of sound to kind of bring us into that space. Over the last couple of weeks on Radio Boston, we've talked to a number of local Russians, Ukrainians. We will do more tomorrow. And on the day that the invasion began, we actually wiped our show that morning and redid the show, right? Brought in lots of local voices. And one was a man named Slava Olenek, who is a Ukrainian-American living in Framingham, Massachusetts. We had a conversation about his concerns with people at home, how he was perceiving the conflict on that first day, and I want to play a little sound from that.
What we all must understand that it's not just about Ukraine, it's about stability in Europe, because he will, if given a chance, he will go further. He will challenge the NATO resolve. He will challenge the world order. And most importantly, we should not fear him.
I want to bring this back first to the United States and then to the region, and what this means for us. And we've seen a lot of conversation, for example, about the pressure from both sides on Biden, both politically and economically, around the move he made today with Russian oil. We've seen moves here in the Commonwealth and in other states around the country to ban Russian products, get vodka out of liquor stores, all kinds of things. Let's start with the top two things that you're each watching about impact on the U.S., and then we'll come further to our regional community here. And Monica, I'll let you go first on this one.
Well, I think the most obvious, I filled up my car this weekend and, gas prices are high. So I'm going to be using unfortunately I have an electric car. So I'm going to be using that a lot more. And why that matters is, of course, President Biden is facing already inflationary problems and issues. And so it's going to impact our domestic politics. So that's one. And the second thing is how we spin out the narrative, how the administration, about the sanctions and what to expect from the sanctions. Sanctions take time, and I really hope that this administration educates Americans about what the sanctions are about. They haven't really explained this, what we expect from the sanctions. And importantly, I think also to the Russian government about what it would take for those sanctions to be removed. And I think if the Biden administration could start doing that and speaking to us as if we would understand, so that the American population would have buy-in on this. Because really we already talked about the no-fly zones. We cannot get involved and have Americans get involved in this war, ground troops. Which means that sanctions are our best, worst means for trying to change this man's behavior. And by the way, these sanctions are unprecedented. And by the way, they're against a country that is a major power and a major global trader, particularly in commodities, wheat, oil, gas. We haven't been here before. And so we're actually not sure. So food prices might go up, right? Russia and Ukraine provide, my understanding is 25% of wheat. Global wheat, that's a lot. Oil, we already heard talk that Russia provides 10%, right, of energy supplies. That's a lot. We may see negotiations with Iran go better, because if we can get Iran back online, that's 1.5% of the global supply. So I think, at a very personal household level, prices are likely to go up, particularly energy prices. And then I really do hope that this administration, and I think Biden has done an admirable job shepherding this. Thank God he has a lot of foreign policy experience. But I hope that he takes the time to really talk to us about what the American public should expect as this sanction regime is unfolded. And I haven't seen that yet. He talked a little bit about it at his State of the Union, but we need the full story.
What are you watching for, Emily?
Well, one thing I've been watching a lot kind of in the time leading up to this, one thing I think a lot of Americans know about is the Kremlin propaganda machine, how Russia uses disinformation to, create false narratives. But one of the things that I think maybe we didn't think about is the effect of 4 years of a president who was not very interested in being engaged globally, the effect that had on the U.S. population. And I think, I'm not going to argue that Vladimir Putin, invaded Ukraine because of American public opinion. But the fact that American public opinion was strongly against foreign intervention, we were dealing with the fallout of the pullout from Afghanistan. American public opinion in general is not supportive of intervening in foreign affairs right now, especially at this type of scale that it would involve in Ukraine. And I think that that's something that Vladimir Putin knew and knew that he could take advantage of. So I think, I'm not sure how that exactly answers this question and how it'll resonate here at home. I think it's important for us to think about the things that, the way the American public engages with what's going on. Those types of things matter to Vladimir Putin as much as they matter to Volodymyr Zelensky.
So let me ask you this in follow-up then, based on what you just said. We have certainly seen here in the region and across the country a real outpouring of support, a sense of solidarity. People are riveted by this, talking about it, paying attention. Do you anticipate a potential shift in the United States towards being more supportive of external engagement than we've had in the last few years?
I think so, if only because people do seem to understand the stakes, and maybe that's partly because the Russian or Kremlin propaganda machine has worked so well to get Vladimir Putin into our heads. We know who this guy is, and all of a sudden, he's the figurehead of everything that's wrong with what's happening. That mobilizes people in the same way that the Ukrainian President Zelensky's, staying in Kyiv and refusing to leave and making these great little sound bites about what he needs. That's galvanizing people. I think it's a conflict in which the side of good and evil is very clear, and that makes it very easy for people to know which side they fall on. And it doesn't hurt that the Ukrainian community in the United States is so well organized. They've been organized for years and years. So immediately they were organizing rallies, telling people where to donate, how else to help, and they've I think really helped people feel like it's worth being involved because you're not just sitting at home watching this on TV. You actually can do something to help. So I don't think that hurts.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I hope you're right, Emily. I do. I really hope you're right that Americans stay focused on this. But, we know that foreign policy is not the primary interest of Americans, right? Americans vote with their pocketbooks. And the problem is that our economy is it's already hurting, right? We're already paying higher gas prices. And so the question is if it's the case that Putin and company can get the major cities, get Kharkiv, get Kyiv, right? And we stop seeing the massive flows of refugees every night on the TV and the horror stories, in a couple of weeks, and we sort of live with a dire situation for the Ukrainians, but for the Americans it becomes bearable. I mean, when I teach on civil wars and wars, in my classes, and one of my students says, but we have to absolutely do something about this, and I said, you're right, this is a horror, this is why I study war, because it's brutal, it's humans killing humans, right? I said, but are you aware of how many people have died in Congo? 3 million. Right. Do you know how many people have died in Syria? 280,000. So we do seem to have the capacity to bear a lot of horrible situations, and right now this one is in our face. The question is I think you're absolutely right. There is a global response on this one. We don't know where China is going to land. China is still on the fence. And if China, ends up becoming the great mediator of this, hopefully that will end it quickly. But I think if this keeps going on and the brutality, we do see refugees flowing out, and it keeps going into months. I hate to say it, the American attention span isn't the longest, particularly when it comes to foreign policy issues. So I'm a little sanguine, I'm a little uncertain at this point about whether we're going to be able to sustain this kind of interest, especially when when the American pocketbook is starting to get a little thinner.
So to that point, Emily, you talked a moment ago about how well organized the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States is around mobilizing and advocating and making people aware, protesting, humanitarian mobilization. And I'm going to put a pin right here because I want to come back to humanitarian in just a minute, but I want to ask this follow-up question first. Is there a chance they can keep our attention in a way that other countries haven't been able to, or is that squirrel just so overwhelming that eventually it will happen here too?
Probably. I mean, if we, take previous experiences as the example, probably so. But what I think is different is what the diaspora has created in terms of a more systematic structure. So, I mean, I've seen just astronomical amounts of money being generated and sent by reputable organizations to people in Ukraine and organizations in Ukraine. Honestly, I hope that sustains them for some time so they are able to keep doing the work even after our attention has turned to something else. So I don't know if, depends on what the time span of this is, right? If this is something where we can agree to a ceasefire and start, really in earnest diplomatic negotiations that might change something, hopefully we won't be asking people to pay attention for a very long time. I don't know if that's likely, but I probably doubt that this is different than other situations, although I really, truly have been so heartened by the response. I mean, we've basically worked to create networks to place scholars from Ukraine at institutions across the United States. We don't even have people who need them yet because there are so many placements in Europe, there are so many placements closer to home, right? So at this point, it sort of depends on how protracted this becomes.
Okay, so I'm going to come here and take the pin back out of this one now. I'm going to take a listener question and then I'm going to kind of shape it for us. So the question is, what are the best things that the U.S. and other European countries can do to assist with this refugee and humanitarian crisis? So staying in that refugee and humanitarian space. What I think I'll do is, Monica, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to respond from the context of sovereign states, from actual countries. And then Emily, then let's talk civil society, NGOs, private voluntary organizations, et cetera. So Monica, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is keeping the borders open, right? The question is can we keep the corridors safe, that those borders, so that people can make it across? And honestly, when you talk to people who are experts on refugees, what do they want? Money, 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 because it's fungible, and then they can really provide for what the refugees need. And so if anybody's listening and they go to the International Red Cross and those kinds of organizations, these reputable organizations, because from a humanitarian perspective, what people need is food, shelter, right? And then once they get into the receiving states, then they get education, medical care, and that kind of thing. What's astonishing is that how open Europe has been. It's a very different situation than what we faced when the wars in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And then, of course, the refugees coming out of Afghanistan and Syria. And we had to set up huge refugee camps in Greece and in Turkey. And that created a lot of tension, actually, within Europe. In this case, part of it, because of the holdover, the narrative of World War II, and refugees and the horrors of the Nazi regime, and an affinity, right, that many people are seeing themselves and their ethnic brethren, right, in the eyes of these Ukrainians that are trying to flee. And at this point, we haven't needed refugee camps. People are opening their homes and saying, yes, I have an extra bedroom for a mother and a child, or that sort of thing. So I think the bottom line, in terms of humanitarian, is really providing the supplies that the professional organizations need. And then if it gets so horrific, really talking to your congresspeople about saying, let's bring some refugees here, but we have the excess capacity, we can do this, allow for more to come in to the United States.
So I do want to pick up on a thread on that for just a second, and we can, you talked about people seeing themselves ethnically. And of course, one of the criticisms that we've been hearing is that white refugees that look like Western countries coming out of Ukraine are receiving a different kind of treatment than black and brown refugees have from the other crises that you named. Do you find truth to that?
Yes, unfortunately. And that is the case. I mean, when we think about Turkey, holding on to Arab populations, right? Afghan populations, and unfortunately that is the case. Like, humans, when I teach on nationalism and ethnicity, and humans are groupists, and they're going to identify more with people who look like them. We know this. In hiring practices, you tend to hire people who look like you, right? And unfortunately, we're seeing this on a global scale work out in that way. It's tragic, it's sad. Think about when airlines crash. What's the first thing that they announce? 5 Americans were killed. And that always irritates me. It's like, no, 130 humans were killed. And so unfortunately, in this case, it does matter that these people who are fleeing the border, many of whom, not all of whom, were hearing those terrible stories of particularly students trying to get out or recent immigrants to Ukraine that don't happen to share the same skin color. Colorism, unfortunately, in the 21st century is alive and well, and it's playing out in this refugee crisis.
Thanks for answering that head on. I'll come to you, Emily, now to talk about, remember the original question was the humanitarian and refugee response. So civic organizations, individual volunteers, NGOs.
Yeah, and I think the real difference in these two aspects of the question is that the access that we have to helping people who have gotten across the border is very different than the access we have to the people who have not gotten across the border. So for one, PayPal, Venmo, they don't work in Ukraine. You can't just send somebody some money and help them get out. So that's why we see these civic networks crop up. So that's why, in Kiev, people who are staying are organizing, defensive organizations, which are also being used to help when humanitarian exits need to be made, right? It's these people who have volunteered to take up weapons who are then helping people get evacuated. There's, like I mentioned before, networks of people who are just sort of sharing information, and that's within, like a spreadsheet of I have this and I need this. It's really self-organized is the word that I use. It basically, when people understand that there is a gap being left by some type of institution, whether that be the government or somebody else, but they have the skills, to meet those needs, they're going to meet them. And so it's really, I think the big difference that maybe a lot of people don't understand about Ukraine or didn't know before this is that Ukrainians are very tech forward. Ukraine has one of the biggest and fastest growing tech economies in the world, and Ukrainians are great at tech. And so they are using their tech skills, transferring those into not only fighting cyber war, but basically using their skills to mobilize, finding ways, back-channel ways to connect with one another to do what they need. And so because there are not guaranteed humanitarian corridors right now, people are just doing that kind of stuff themselves. And people, I should point out, people are dying because of this. They're dying while trying to deliver necessary medical aid. They're dying while trying to, feed animals that have been left behind. So they're doing everything they can, but they don't have the same protections that people who have become refugees have at this point.
So I'm going to stay with you for a minute longer and ask you a follow-up, and then Monica, we've got a couple of questions that I'm going to send back in your direction. I'll kind of bundle them for you. Here, Commonwealth, region, what are you seeing that is inspiring or striking or new in terms of organizing for response?
Well, we've seen, maybe some of you have been to some of the rallies over on the weekends. They have been huge, and I will say a friend of mine in Ukraine, I posted a couple of videos for him, and he was so happy. He's just a guy who cares a lot about Ukrainian architecture, and he posts a lot of those pictures on Instagram, and now he's starting to collect videos from rallies around the world, and every day I send him a new one. He says, "This is amazing. It means so much to see that." And that it feels like nothing to me to go into the street for an hour or two, but it means the world to him. So that's been really great. I think people are gathering supplies. We've had a really clear idea of what is needed and what isn't needed. So something like, for example, medical equipment and medicine. There's limited supply in Ukraine and on the border as well. So people have been gathering what they can medically to take over with them or to ship. We've seen the large shipping companies, Mist and Nova Pochta, have both lifted all their fees to deliver to Ukraine. So basically you can ship humanitarian packages of supplies for free thanks to these organizations. So one thing I think that's remarkable that we're seeing here, but more broadly, is just corporations that previously might be known for wanting to profit off of a bad situation are actually trying to do what they can to help by lifting fees and that sort of thing. And just, I think, in general, the number of people who here are interested and engaged and making sure that they're sharing good information and learning what they can. On Harvard campus, we've got so many students from so many different parts of campus who want to be involved. So just there's so much mobilization and energy, I think that's a good response. Instead of feeling we're so far away, we can't do anything, the response being that people want to help and that those networks exist to help, that's been really fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Monica, I'll come back to you now. We have a couple of different questions, so we're going to step back again to the more global. We had narrowed down to humanitarian and refugee. This is more Russia. And the question is to understand better the scope and breadth of the misinformation and disinformation inside of Russia. I think there are people struggling with, is it really possible that huge swaths of Russians really don't even know war is happening? And talk a little bit more about what that disinformation looks like.
Yeah, so Putin has spent a number of years constructing a narrative that he's the great savior, first of all. So this is a man that's loved. There's many who believe he's infallible, right? And he presents that image. One of the reasons why he was chosen by Yeltsin, President Yeltsin, was he was young and he was sportivny, right? He was sporty, right? And so that's why you see him, I think actually one of the most damaging things for him, when I heard this, again, a little bit of delight, was he was kicked out of the International Judo Association. Yay, smart, because that's going to pain, this is a small, petty man, all right? That's going to pain him on a personal level. But in any event, so Putin has built up this image that he's infallible, and honestly, in the global arena, he's done a pretty good job. He's pushed above his weight, he's punched above his weight in terms of Russia's economy and Russia's sort of political system is admirable. So part of that program was getting control of information and killing off basically his opposition, both in terms of the media, but then also his real opposition. Don't forget, he assassinated Nemtsov, right? Boris Nemtsov, who was probably the big challenger to him, and now we've got Alex Navalny, who he poisoned, right? And so this is a guy who holds no bars held, right? No holds barred at all, that he is willing to take on in order to get his way and to get his image presented. And the thing is, he's not alone in doing this. The Soviet Union had an extremely sophisticated disinformatsia system. We could go back and talk about the AIDS crisis and how they created a whole story about AIDS and its creation. And this ended up percolating, right, as the common narrative. And so Putin, as a KGB, FSB guy, understands the power of information and how to craft narratives, how to control the media, and he's been doing it, Tiziana, and there's not an alternative. Now, if you're educated, if you're well-traveled, you're well-heeled, you understand there's alternative sources. But many people in Russia are not well-traveled. They're not well-heeled. They lived in the villages, or they're not traveling outside of Moscow, and they're watching Russian TV, or they're watching or reading government newspapers, and they're going to get just that narrative. And as of last week, all of the independent news stations are now done. They're shut. They're closed. And those people who are educated, who can get those virtual privacy networks, or can talk to us on the phone, and can get the information, will continue to do so. But that's not the regular Russian citizen that's getting that information. And they've been fed this for at least 8 years. And they've been fed the story that Ukraine is under a Nazi regime that's violating the rights of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, and that Putin's the great savior to go in there and save them.
Do we know, just so I can be clear from a journalistic standpoint, do we know that he was responsible for the assassination and the poisoning?
I can't answer that at this moment. I'm not. We suspect pretty much.
Okay.
That Nemtsov. Look, Nemtsov. It was so symbolic. I mean, it happened right outside the Kremlin. And then Navalny. Look, Navalny has had Putin in his sights, which means Putin has him in his sights. So look, Putin is a. He can get other people to do his bidding. This is back to this circle, right? And as a KGB guy, an FSB guy, he knows how to collect information. He knows how to collect dirt on people in order to get them to do. This is how he controls the oligarchs, right? And so he may not have a direct hand in it, but it's the wink and the nod. You know, like, yeah, we need Navalny out. He's too dangerous for us. He's presenting an alternative. He's showing how corrupt we are. And similarly with Nemtsov, right, that he's trying to talk democracy and openness, transparency, accountability. And this is not a regime. It's many books have been written about this as a kleptocracy. I mean, Putin is considered the richest man in the world, right? And the Russian state, there's poverty. There's malnourishment. There's people who are homeless. How can that be, right? So in terms of direct hand, Tiziana, I'd say probably not. He was too smart for that. But the idea that he wouldn't have minded if those two went their own way, one of whom did, sadly, I think the wink and the nod, absolutely.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask a longer follow-up, and then I'm just mindful of time. We're going to go into a little bit of a lightning round after that. So another thing that is on my mind, I'm going to bring it back here home, both to the United States and regionally. We are seeing a lot of organizing for the Ukrainian people, organizing in the diaspora. We are also seeing real pushback on the Russian diaspora. We're seeing, small businesses no longer able to carry products. We're hearing increased sense of anger and vitriol at Russia and Russians. We have a past in the United States that then leads us to hate, bullying, physically acting out. Do either of you have concern? And I am not in any way downplaying the concern and the importance of the risk to the Ukrainian people. Mm-hmm. But do you have concern about backlash to Russians here in the region and Russians in America? Go ahead, Emily.
Well, I think it's probably true. I mean, I don't know as many Russians as I do Ukrainians, to be sure. But I do think it's probably very common for many Russians who live and have made their lives in the U.S. to have left, in part at least, because they didn't like living in an autocracy, didn't like living in a dictatorship. And so it would sadden me to think, that these are people who made a choice and don't represent the regime and would be treated as if they did represent the regime. That's a hard thing to ask of people to make that distinction. Personally, I don't have a problem with, liquor stores not carrying Russian vodka anymore. I mean, that doesn't, those types of things, maybe they won't have a huge wave of impact, but they are symbolic. There's small symbolic things that can be done without hurting, small business people who are maybe from Russia or something like that, right? That still mean a lot, that have an impact in terms of the way I think average people are looking at this conflict. So I kind of would go both ways. I mean, I understand that maybe that's, again, maybe a little optimistic to hope that people will make those kind of distinctions, but it's a tough situation. As like I said, there's a bad guy in this scenario, and we all know who it is. So it can be difficult not to assume that everybody has somehow benefited from him being in power. Many Russians have.
Monica, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Americans we have a history of backlash against people who we may think are the enemy. I would hope through programs like this, people recognize, Emily's exactly right, the people who are living in this country, more often than not, they were trying to escape this system. And the paradox, of course, is now they are again victimized by this system. So I would hope that any sort of backlash, as Emily says, targets things that are directly related to the Russian government, and not to many of whom are Russians here, many of whom are fellow citizens, right? And that we have some compassion because they're suffering too. Ukrainians, everybody, we all agree that this is a wholly unwarranted war, and the level of destruction and death and fear and terror is horrifying. But that doesn't mean also that we can't have some compassion to Russian citizens who are living here, but also American Russian citizens who are living here. I would hope that we could see them as possible allies to try to toss this guy out of government.
All right, let's try a lightning round, and rather than yes or no's, I'm going to give you a sentence. And this is hard, it's a little unfair. And I'm going to go ahead and say it's a little unfair.
As long as we don't have to make it rhyme.
No, you don't. No iambic pentameter required either. So, first, in a sentence, Emily, what is Putin's endgame?
Wipe Ukraine off the map.
Monica, what is Putin's endgame?
I think regime change, no NATO enlargement, and no EU expansion. I don't think that he wants the West. I think he understands that going for the West, and this is more than one sentence, going for the West will be way too costly. in terms of counterinsurgency.
Okay, and I'm taking these from listener ask. So part 2 of that, again in a sentence, Monica, I'll start with you first. Will he move on to other countries?
Again, this is where I was disagreeing with you. I think he's a rational man. I think if he gets the right information about the incompetency of the Russian military, I think he'll understand that he needs to do a strategic retreat to the east.
And Emily, what do you think?
I think that the countries that border Russia should be very cautious right now. And if they are afraid, that is warranted, because the possibility is that, yes, he will go further.
Okay, Emily, this one to you first. Will the Western allies, including the U.S., support an insurgent war if Ukraine were to fall?
Difficult to say. It would, I think, depend honestly on the status of some kind of diplomatic negotiation with Russia. You know, if there's a way to
Getting past that.
too many words. Sorry, everyone. If there's a way to do it above board, I assume that would be the preference.
Monica.
Not so sure, because of what Emily said earlier, the Americans are tired of war. The United States has been a hyper-interventionist power. It's one of the reasons why this is happening in Ukraine. Kosovo, 1999, Putin loves that war. We went in there without a UN resolution, and I'm not sure the American population will stomach another insurgency.
Okay, staying with you, the next one. What will China do?
That is a really excellent question. Now, what's interesting about that, I'm going to give a couple of sentences, is that 90% of China's trade is not with Russia, only 10% is. She likes to stay under the radar, right? He wants to just be able to keep his economy humming and growing the economy and influence globally. So I think she might come out of this as the grand peacemaker.
Emily, what do you think?
I agree. I think if the rest of the world's response to Russia makes it a bad choice for China to take Russia's side, that could force Xi's hand.
Okay. Last in the lightning round, Emily, you first. It's Tuesday. Between now and Sunday, what are you most watching?
Well, frankly, I'm most hoping for humanitarian corridors out of the cities that are under siege right now. I would like to see people be allowed to be evacuated.
And Monica, how about you?
Military maneuvers. Does he get Kharkiv? Do they consolidate in Kherson and Mariupol? And what happens to Odessa?
Okay. And last one. What's the last thought you'd like to share with our audience?
So, you know, this is personal, right, in a sense. So I joined the Army when I was 17 as a Russian linguist and was stationed in West Germany. I was part of the hostages, American hostages and troops. I can't believe I'm here 40 years later, and Moscow is now moving west. And so for me, it's just such a tragedy. And in the as somebody who's been teaching war for the last 30 years in order to prevent war, I'm sad that I'm in this situation, that I'm now an expert. I'm a Cold War warrior again. And what I see happening is the decivilizing of civilization. I think it's that serious a situation that we're in. This is a great power with nuclear weapons invading a smaller power. And what's really particularly, the nuclear weapons are incredibly difficult to deal with, but they see them as brothers. And if they're willing to beat up and kill these people, I agree with Emily, keep an eye out about what he would do next. So this decivilizing of civilization, I can't believe I'm facing that. After I've already served in the Army, I thought the evil empire was gone, and I feel like here we are. I don't want to say it's round 2 of the Cold War. The world has changed. I think our response, the global response, has been phenomenal. We haven't seen anything like that, but we are in very dangerous days.
Thank you. Emily, your last thought?
I think I would just say, you know, don't look away for as long as you know, even if you want to. This is affecting people in a truly unimaginable way, and just it might hurt a little bit when you fill your car up, but just think about what people in Ukraine are living through right now. Every time you have to add a couple of cents on it, I think it's, you know, the least we can do with the power that we have is to try to force Putin's hand to make a different choice. Don't feel disempowered. I think it's really important to remember things like, you know, the information that you read online and share in your networks. That's important. That matters. Sharing the truth coming out of Ukraine, it matters a lot. and that can make you hopefully feel a little bit like every day you can do a little bit of something to help people hear the voices from Ukraine and help people understand what Ukrainians are protecting the rest of the world from right now.
So I want to thank everybody for coming together tonight, both virtually here in the room and on the panel, for this town hall of exploration and learning together. We appreciate it. I do want to let folks know that you can find more of our reporting on the Ukraine crisis and how it's impacting New England, and find out more about our next events here at CitySpace by going to WBUR.org. I do want to ask you now to join me in thanking Monica Duffy Toft, Professor of International Politics at Tufts Fletcher School, and Emily Channell-Justice, who is the Director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at Harvard University. Please join me in thanking them for their time today. So we're going to go out a little differently tonight. As we stand up and shake hands and put our coats on, we'd like to bring you a little more sound from a member of our community, a Ukrainian voice, Olga Lisovska, who was a Ukrainian singer who emigrated to the United States in the 1990s. She's now based in Newton. The first time we spoke with her on Radio Boston was actually prior to the invasion, when there was concern about there being one. And at the end of our conversation, she wanted to share a song with us. And we asked her which song she brought, and she was very clear that she had spoken to other Ukrainians in her immediate community, and to a one, they wanted her to sing a song called Prayer for Ukraine. So as I thank you for joining us, and as we make our way out tonight, we will do so hearing Olga sing Prayer for Ukraine.
Боже великий єдиний, нам Україну храни, волі світу промінням ти її осіни, світлом науки і знання нас дітей просвіти, в чистій любові до краю ти нас, Боже, зрости. Дай йому волю, дай йому долю, дай